So we're looking today on this first Sunday after Easter at what the resurrection means for the world. In just a few days, we went from Palm Sunday to Maundy Thursday to Good Friday. Good Friday, the stark reminder of the price that God paid in sending Jesus Christ to die on the cross for you and for me. The price that Jesus paid in accepting the cup from his Father and submitting to the earthly powers. And the price that as his followers we will pay when we take up our cross and follow him. And so for the disciples, for his friends, for Mary, they were left without the man that they had followed. They were perhaps beginning to get their heads around what had happened. Their friend and leader and teacher dying on a cross. Wondering how to respond and what to do with themselves. At best, being at something of a loose end, and at worst, being completely out of their minds. What had just happened? What were they to think? What were they to do now? And then, with just 2 nights sleep in between, in no time at all, it's Easter Day, and Jesus Christ is risen. Unprecedented, unimaginable, uncontainable. The grave could not hold him down. He rose from the grave, and they move from their place of grief and loss to wonder, to disbelief, and to joy. I wonder if you can think of something in your life that has been a time of disorientation, but ultimately it was a positive thing. I can remember when I learnt to fly a small aeroplane. I flew a Cessna 152 and I was training for my private pilot's license. And I flew cross country, which means going to 2 different airports and then back, so completing a triangle. And there was that sense of wondering, have I really done this? Was this just something that was a dream or in my imagination? Thankfully, in that case, I had the paperwork to prove that I'd been to the 2 airports. And 1 or 2 photographs as well. The resurrection is disorientating. It's disorientating in a good way, but it's disorientating. For the world, the resurrection is not so much about being disorientating, but perhaps about reorientating it. We're going to be taking a look at the reading from 2 Corinthians 5, 11 to 21. If you've got a Bible then and it's yours, then get your pen out and circle the odd verses 15, 17 and 19. Because in what I say today, I'm going to be saying something about each of these 3 aspects. Taking the words from those verses, my 3 points. He died for all. We're a new creation. And he reconciled the world. So firstly, he died for all. It's quite hard to get our heads around that fact sometimes, that Jesus died for all. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 15 says this, "And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again." There are no exclusions here. Jesus didn't die for some of us, but for all of us. And that is the good news for the world. And verse 15 talks about what it means for people to respond to Jesus. Not to live for themselves, but to live for him. When it comes to our mission as Christian, sharing faith with others, this is why. This is why we do it. Because Jesus died for all. The good news that Jesus is for us needs to be shared. At St. George's we have a phrase, we're here to live and share the good news of Jesus Christ. Through the ages, Christians have developed special words to define this whole thing and what it means. There are evangelists, missionaries, mission agencies, and then academics who study these things, and we call them missiologists. There are courses we can go on and books to read. And the risk in all of this is that sharing the good news that Jesus died gets left to the experts. And so we can end up not sharing the good news unless we go on a mission. I love collecting airline miles and redeem them for flights and things. And right now, they're pretty much totally useless because none of us are going anywhere. But I often will regale people of stories of how I've earned miles from this particular deal or that particular deal, or I signed up to an email and got some bonus miles there. And as I talk about miles, I can get quite excited. I'll stop talking about it now because I'm saying that to make a point that when we get excited about something, when we see that it makes a difference to us, we can't help but tell people about it. It happens naturally. And so if we want to share the good news that Christ died for all we have to do is start talking about it in a natural way. So we share our own story, and our story is ongoing. When someone asks you, what did you do over Easter? You might tell them about the great show that you saw on Netflix. You might tell them about the family meal you had at home and the conference call that you did with Zoom. But it's just as easy to say, I couldn't go to church, and so I watched church on YouTube or on my television. Because if Jesus is being raised from the dead is good news for us and for our friends and family too. If he really did die for them too, then we probably should mention it. He died for all, and we're a new creation. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here. Being a new creation is a bit like if I take some time and draw a picture, and then I scrunch up the picture and I throw it away, and then I redraw the picture. I've made a new creation. But actually that's kind of limited because it's not so much that the new creation is going to throw the old one away. Maybe it's a bit more like those of you who are into cars or railway locomotives. I can remember the Flying Scotsman, which is this famous train that went from London to Scotland in the UK, no surprise there. And the Flying Scotsman was restored a few years ago. And when it was restored, it was like it was better than before. Because the components had been changed, the nuts and the bolts and the rivets had been repainted, the rusty pieces would have been replaced, the components, mechanics inside the locomotive would have been improved. And so the recreated Flying Scotsman has been restored in such a way that it is better than it was before. And that is the picture for us as Christians, that we're a new creation in Christ. Jesus was resurrected in the same body. He had the wounds, and doubting Thomas touched them. It was the same Jesus. How is the resurrection good news for the world? Well, the world is on a downward spiral. We have a finite amount of resources, and we are using them up. And all that tends to vary is the rate that we're using them up. Take low energy light bulbs, for example. They use less energy than ordinary incandescent bulbs that we used to see all the time. But all we're doing is slowing the rate of energy use because we can't replenish the fossil fuels that most of the world use to create its power as fast as we're burning them up. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, how the world will be created, especially now. Maybe it's something like where there was a quarry and a lake being put in its place afterwards, and plants forming around, and it becoming a wildlife nature reserve. The resurrection will mean, for the world, thinking outside the box. It will take us beyond our comfort zones in our minds. Jesus was resurrected in the same body, so why wouldn't the world be the same? The new heavens and the new earth that we read about later on in the Bible probably doesn't mean we can destroy this one, because God's insurance policy will provide the replacement. As we're made new creations through Jesus Christ, so we become agents for doing God's work of creating the new creation in the world. I'll come to that in a moment. Thirdly, reconciling the world. 2 Corinthians 5:18, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. And verse 19, that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them. And he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. So the resurrection points to our need to be a people who reconcile, to stand near to the gap and reach out a hand of Christ to people so that they might take hold. Verse 20, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors. As though God were making his appeal through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Wow. We are to be people who reconcile the world with God. We are ambassadors. Ambassadors build links. They represent a country. They almost create a mini piece of the country they're from, in the country where they're living. And that's what we're to do as Christians in the world. It means collectively as a church, but it also means as individuals within the church. So we're left with a mission imperative. If Jesus Christ, being raised from the dead, is really good news for the world, which of course I believe it is, if it's really good news for the world and everyone in it, what does that mean that we need to go and do? We're called to be ambassadors for Christ. Resurrection is good news for the whole world. In the Anglican Church, we talk about the 5 marks of mission, which are to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, to teach, baptize, and nurture new believers, to respond to human need by loving service, to seek to transform the unjust structures of society, and to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. How do we spread this good news of the resurrection? We can narrow those 5 sentences down to 5 words beginning with T. We're to tell, to teach, to tend, to transform, and to treasure. Jesus died for all. We are a new creation, and we are to reconcile the world. So I'll leave you with that to think about, and as you go into the week ahead, I would encourage you to find ways to share good news, because the world right now needs good news. The world needs hope. And in Jesus, in his resurrection, we have good news and hope that can be shared.